I never thought a simple unpaid fine would cost me my home, but when the HOA decided to auction off my house over a petty fee, they unknowingly set something in motion that would change everything. They thought they had the power, that their rules were absolute, and that I would simply walk away in defeat. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't the type to accept injustice lying down. The same HOA that ripped my house away from me had no idea that one day, I would sit in the very office they ruled from, because after everything they put me through, I made sure their headquarters became mine. And when the day finally came for them to realize what had happened, their panic was worth every sleepless night I had endured planning my revenge. It all started with an envelope, one of those thin, ominous letters with the HOA's logo stamped in the top left corner. At first, I wasn't concerned. Just another routine notice, I assumed, probably some new ridiculous regulation about mailbox colors or grass height. But when I opened it, my stomach twisted. Past due balance, $280. A fine for failure to maintain approved exterior paint color. I frowned, remembering how I had repainted my shutters a few months ago, an exact match to what had been there before. But the letter claimed I had failed to submit an approval request, even though I knew for a fact I had. I dug through my files, found the emailed approval from 6 months prior, and exhaled in relief. This was just a misunderstanding. I'd send the proof, clear it up, and move on. Simple. Or so I thought. The next letter came 2 weeks later, and this time, the fine had ballooned to over $800, with additional penalties tacked on for non-compliance and late fees. I called the HOA office immediately, only to be met with a cold, dismissive response. They claimed they had no record of my approval request, and any further dispute would need to be submitted in writing, accompanied by a processing fee. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They wanted me to pay to dispute a fine that shouldn't exist in the first place. Furious, I mailed in a formal challenge along with copies of the original approval, assuming logic would prevail. But I had underestimated just how deep the corruption ran. Days turned into weeks, and the fines kept piling up. Each notice was more aggressive than the last, each new charge more absurd than the one before. I had never missed a mortgage payment, never violated any serious rule, but the HOA had found a loophole in their own system, one that allowed them to seize homes over unpaid fees that exceeded a certain threshold. And just like that, I found myself in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. A final letter arrived, colder than the ones before. It stated that my debt had now surpassed $3,500, and due to non-payment, my home was scheduled for auction in 30 days. I fought. I hired a lawyer, I went to meetings, I gathered neighbors to stand by my side. But it was no use. The HOA had rigged the system in their favor. By the time the auction date arrived, my house, the home I had worked for, the place where I had built my life, was gone. Sold to an unknown buyer for a fraction of its value. I stood outside the property line, watching someone else sign the papers to my own home, feeling a fire burn in my chest that I had never felt before. They had taken everything from me. But they had no idea what was coming next. Because while they were busy celebrating their easy victory, I was already planning my next move. And if they thought I was going to disappear quietly, they were dead wrong. Losing my home should have broken me, but instead, it ignited something far stronger, an unshakable resolve to take back what was mine and ensure that those responsible paid the price. As I stood on the sidewalk, watching a stranger claim the property I had poured years of my life into, I made a silent vow: I would not stop until I had turned the tables completely. The HOA thought they had won, but they had no idea that this so-called victory was the beginning of their downfall. They had used their power to strip me of my home, never anticipating that I would find a way to strip them of theirs. What they did to me, I would do to them, but legally, systematically, and in a way they would never see coming. It was time to play their game, but with my own set of rules. I started by researching everything I could about the HOA's finances. Most people assumed these associations operated like small neighborhood clubs, but I knew better. HOAs, especially the ones run by power-hungry individuals, thrived on bureaucracy, hidden fees, and legal loopholes designed to funnel money into their own pockets. The more I dug, the more I realized just how reckless my HOA had been with their power. Their so-called fines were just the tip of the iceberg. I combed through financial records, public filings, and legal documents, finding inconsistencies that hinted at something much larger. Questionable expenditures, missing funds, unexplained invoices. If I hadn't been furious before, I certainly was now. They had taken my home over a minor fine while they sat on a pile of mismanaged money, exploiting homeowners with impunity. But they had made a mistake. In their arrogance, they had never expected someone like me to look too closely. The deeper I went, the clearer my strategy became. The HOA was financially overextended. They had spent more money than they had, relying on fines and fees to cover their reckless spending. Their biggest asset? The office building they operated out of, a property that had been purchased with community funds but was technically owned by the HOA itself. And in their desperation to maintain control, they had recently taken out a high-interest loan against that very building. That was all I needed. If they could exploit loopholes to take my home, then I could use those same loopholes to take theirs. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to own the very place from which they had orchestrated their corruption. I began by quietly acquiring any outstanding debts linked to the HOA. It took time, patience, and careful maneuvering, but I slowly positioned myself as a key creditor. They had stretched themselves too thin, borrowing against their own assets while assuming no one would ever challenge them. But when the financial pressure mounted, they had no choice but to put their office building up for auction to cover their debts. Just like they had done with my home, I waited in the shadows, let them believe they were still in control, until the day came when the auction was announced, and I was the one standing in the crowd, prepared to buy the very place where they had sealed my fate. The auction was eerily familiar, except this time, I was the one making the winning bid. With every word the auctioneer spoke, I felt the power shifting. The HOA board members sat in stunned silence as they realized who was about to take control of their headquarters. I had done to them what they had done to me, only this time, there was no loophole to save them. The moment the final gavel fell, I turned to see the panic set in. The same faces that had once smirked at me as they stole my home were now frozen in disbelief. They had lost, and this time, there was no coming back. As I signed the final paperwork, securing my ownership over the HOA office building, I looked up to meet the eyes of the same officials who had dismissed my pleas just months ago. They had thought they were untouchable, that their rules only applied when it suited them. But now, the very space where they had ruled over homeowners with an iron fist belonged to me. They had taken my house over a mere fine, never expecting that I would take their headquarters in return. And this was just the beginning. Because now that I owned the building, I held the power to dismantle everything they had built, and I had every intention of doing exactly that. Owning the HOA's office building was only the first step. My goal wasn't just to take their headquarters, I wanted to dismantle their entire operation, brick by brick, exposing the corruption they had buried under years of bureaucracy and intimidation. With the deed now in my hands, I wasted no time in making my presence known. The moment the ink dried, I walked into what had once been their domain, taking in the stunned faces of the board members who had orchestrated my downfall. The irony was almost poetic. They had thought themselves invincible, untouchable, yet here they were, now tenants in a building they no longer controlled. And I was their new landlord. The weight of their own arrogance settled in as they realized there was no way out of what was coming next. I started by tightening the screws. The first move was to revise their lease agreement, increasing their rent beyond what they could comfortably afford. They had been so careless with their finances, so certain that they would always have control, that they had left themselves no safety net. Their revenue relied entirely on squeezing money out of homeowners through unjust fines, but with their office expenses skyrocketing under my ownership, that well was about to dry up. Every additional dollar they had to spend on rent meant less money for their underhanded operations. But I wasn't satisfied with just financially crippling them. I wanted to unravel their entire system of power from the inside out. The next step was to dig deeper into their financial mismanagement. I hired forensic accountants to comb through years of HOA expenditures, and what they uncovered was worse than I had anticipated. Lavish retreats under the guise of board meetings, expensive dinners charged as business expenses, thousands of dollars funneled into unexplained maintenance projects that never actually took place. It was blatant, shameless embezzlement hidden behind layers of official-looking paperwork. And then there were the fines, the ones they had weaponized against homeowners, forcing people into financial distress while they lined their own pockets. This wasn't just incompetence, it was outright fraud. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that they had been running the HOA like a personal piggy bank, preying on the very residents they were supposed to serve. Armed with undeniable proof, I made my next move. I filed formal complaints with state authorities, detailing every instance of financial misconduct I had uncovered. I sent the evidence to local news outlets, ensuring that their corruption would be exposed for all to see. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to the homeowners they had victimized over the years, rallying them together, giving them the proof they needed to demand change. The HOA had relied on fear and intimidation to keep people silent, but now, that fear was shifting in the opposite direction. The same board members who had laughed in my face, who had dismissed my protests as nothing more than an inconvenience, were now scrambling to contain the damage. Their carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing, and for the first time, they had nowhere to hide. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Homeowners began questioning where their fees had gone, demanding audits and refunds for fraudulent charges. The news coverage had turned the HOA into a public disgrace, with reporters swarming their once powerful board members, forcing them to answer for their actions. And as the financial strain became unbearable, their legal troubles multiplied. Civil suits were filed, state investigations launched, and one by one, the board members who had once wielded unchecked power found themselves backed into a corner. Some tried to fight, clinging desperately to their crumbling authority, but others saw the writing on the wall and resigned in disgrace. And then came the final blow. The HOA defaulted on their debts. The financial burden I had placed on them, combined with the legal battles they now faced, had drained their reserves to nothing. They could no longer afford the office space they had once ruled from, and as their landlord, I made the decision to terminate their lease. The eviction notice was delivered in the same cold, impersonal tone they had used when they had taken my home from me. The same people who had once laughed as they auctioned off my house now stood outside the building that had once been their headquarters, forced to pack up their things and leave in disgrace. I watched as they carried out boxes filled with years of corruption, their expressions hollow, their arrogance finally shattered. But I wasn't done yet. Owning their building and forcing them out was one thing, but I had one last move to make, something they would never see coming. Because while they were busy trying to salvage what little they had left, I had already set my sights on something much bigger. I wasn't just going to destroy their power. I was going to make sure it never existed again. The moment the HOA board members were evicted from their own office, I knew their reign of corruption was nearing its inevitable collapse. But I wasn't interested in just watching them squirm. I wanted to make sure they never held power again. They had built their control on intimidation, hidden fees, and relentless legal manipulation, but now, with nowhere to operate from and their financial backing crumbling, they were vulnerable in a way they had never been before. The board members who had once dictated every aspect of homeowners' lives were reduced to scrambling for legal cover, desperately trying to salvage what remained of their control. But I had no intention of letting them regroup. While they were licking their wounds, I was already putting my final plan into motion, one that would permanently erase their hold on the community. With the evidence of their corruption widely exposed, I made my next move by petitioning the homeowners to dissolve the HOA altogether. Most people don't realize that an HOA can be dismantled if a majority of residents vote in favor of disbanding it. The problem is, most homeowners don't know they have that power. HOAs thrive on convincing people that they are permanent, untouchable, an inevitable force in their lives. But the reality was different. With the majority of the board either resigning or facing legal trouble, and the HOA drowning in lawsuits and financial ruin, the timing was perfect. I worked with community leaders, longtime residents, and even those who had once been afraid to speak up, gathering signatures, distributing legal documents, and making sure every homeowner understood exactly what had been happening behind the scenes. The momentum was unstoppable. People who had once hesitated, fearing retaliation, now saw the truth. The selective enforcement, the missing funds, the bogus fines. It had all been a scheme to keep a handful of people in control while the rest suffered. The HOA had presented itself as a protector of the community, but now, exposed for what it truly was, the homeowners were eager to strip it of its remaining power. I organized town meetings, public discussions, and legal workshops, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. The petition gained traction faster than I had anticipated, with more and more signatures flooding in as residents realized they had the opportunity to reclaim their neighborhood. The very people who had once cowered before the HOA's petty threats were now standing tall, ready to take back what had been stolen from them. And then, the final vote arrived. The remaining HOA board members, now reduced to a fraction of their former number, tried to fight back, attempting to dispute the petition on technicalities, but it was too late. The legal weight was on my side, and every trick they had once used to control the community had been turned against them. With an overwhelming majority vote, the decision was made, effective immediately, the HOA was to be disbanded. It was over. The structure that had tormented so many, that had ruined lives over trivial violations, was now nothing more than a memory. There would be no more arbitrary fines, no more surveillance of homeowners' private lives, no more abuse of power disguised as neighborhood maintenance. The iron grip they had once held was shattered, and for the first time in years, the residents were free. But I had saved the best for last. Even as the HOA was being dismantled, I still owned their former headquarters, the very office they had been evicted from. And while they had lost everything, I had plans for the building they once ruled from. Instead of selling it off or letting it sit empty, I repurposed it into something that would serve the community, not exploit it. The once feared HOA office was transformed into a community center, a space where homeowners could gather, discuss neighborhood matters, and support each other, without fear of being extorted for money or threatened with legal action. The same doors that had once been closed to residents unless they were being fined were now open to everyone, a symbol of what had been taken back. The former board members scattered, some facing lawsuits, others too humiliated to show their faces again. Their empire of control was nothing but ruins, and the people they had once ruled over had taken back their voices. But the most satisfying moment came when the last remaining HOA official, the very person who had signed off on my home's auction, was forced to come to terms with reality. Their emails went unanswered, their desperate legal threats carried no weight, and as they packed up the last remnants of their failed regime, I watched them disappear from the neighborhood they had once terrorized. Standing outside the newly transformed community center, I took a deep breath, taking in the sight of families enjoying their yards without fear, of homeowners no longer burdened by unjust fines, of a neighborhood finally free. They had thought they could take everything from me, that I would simply accept their authority and move on. But they had been wrong. I had taken everything from them instead, and in the process, I had given the community something far more valuable, its freedom. The downfall of the HOA was complete, but the impact of what had happened stretched far beyond just a few corrupt board members losing their grip on power. The entire neighborhood had changed. Where there had once been an oppressive, watchful force lurking over homeowners, there was now a renewed sense of unity, a shared relief that the era of fines, harassment, and unjust control was over. I watched as people who had once lived in fear now stood tall, finally free to enjoy their homes without the constant threat of violations for trivial offenses. It was strange, in a way, how something that had once seemed so untouchable had crumbled so completely. The board members had built their authority on the assumption that no one would ever challenge them, that the rules they wrote were permanent, unquestionable. But they had underestimated just how much damage they had done, and once that damage was exposed, there was no salvaging what they had built. But I wasn't content with simply erasing their control. I wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. The problem with HOAs wasn't just a single corrupt board, it was the entire system that allowed people like them to operate unchecked, using fine print and legal loopholes to strip homeowners of their rights. The residents in my neighborhood had seen firsthand how easily power could be abused, but other communities were still trapped in the same cycle, unaware of how vulnerable they really were. I decided to take what I had learned and do something more with it. I began speaking with homeowners in other areas, advising them on how to challenge their own HOAs, exposing the same kinds of financial corruption I had uncovered here. What started as a personal battle for justice turned into something far greater, a movement against the unchecked power of these associations. The media had already been covering the story, first as a scandal involving financial fraud and corruption, but then as something more. When they found out I had bought out the HOA's office and repurposed it into a community center, it became a symbol, one that resonated with homeowners everywhere who had felt trapped by unfair rules and endless fines. Soon, I was being contacted by people across the state, some from even farther, sharing their own horror stories, their own struggles against the same kind of board members who had stolen my home. I provided them with resources, with legal contacts, with step-by-step strategies on how to fight back. It was bigger than just my neighborhood now. The system that had let this happen needed to be exposed on a much larger scale. But despite everything I had accomplished, there was one final moment that truly solidified my victory, the day I received a letter from the last remaining former HOA board member, the same one who had signed off on my home's auction. It was a desperate attempt at salvaging their reputation, a pathetic plea for sympathy. They blamed everyone but themselves. The economy, bad legal advice, even the homeowners who had turned against them. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the damage they had caused, only bitterness that they had lost everything. I didn't need to reply. Their fate was already sealed. They had used every ounce of power they had to strip people of their homes, never once imagining that one of those people would fight back with everything they had. Now, they were the ones left with nothing. Standing outside what had once been their headquarters, now bustling with life as a true community hub, I couldn't help but smile. The road to this moment hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every sleepless night, every setback, every battle fought. They had thought they could take my home and get away with it, but they had never considered the possibility that in doing so, they had set off a chain of events that would lead to their own destruction. They had built their rule on greed and manipulation, and in the end, it had consumed them. The neighborhood thrived without them. Property values didn't plummet, as they had once threatened. In fact, they rose, because people actually wanted to live in a place where they weren't constantly under a microscope, where they weren't fined for the color of their garden hose or the number of cars in their driveway. Families felt safe again. Elderly residents who had been afraid of losing their homes to arbitrary fines could now rest easy. And every time I walked past the community center, every time I saw the space being used for something positive instead of a place where homeowners had once been bullied and extorted, I knew I had done the right thing. The best part? The building was still mine. It was never about profit, never about making money off the space, it was about ensuring that no one else could ever use it for the wrong reasons again. The same office where board members had sat in smug confidence, drafting new ways to exploit homeowners, now served as a reminder of what had been taken back. They had tried to take everything from me, never once realizing that they had handed me the very tools I needed to destroy them. And now, as they faded into irrelevance, I remained standing, stronger than ever. Because when they had auctioned off my house over a small fine, they had unknowingly set themselves up for a far greater loss. And now, the place they had once ruled from, the symbol of their power, was mine. Not just in ownership, but in purpose. They had played their games for years, believing they could never be beaten. But in the end, it wasn't me who had lost everything. It was them. And they never even saw it coming.